The unexpected morning. The morning after the gas station encounter, Danielle awoke with the heaviness of exhaustion draped over her like a second blanket. Her body ached from long shifts at the hospital. Her hands cracked from constant scrubbing and latex gloves, and her mind fogged by the ever-present worries of bills and obligations. Sunlight slipped in through the half-closed blinds of her bedroom, warming her face. For a moment she lay still, letting the quiet of dawn soothe her. It was the calm before the storm of another relentless day. She had Marcus to get ready for school, her grandmother to check on, and her own preparation for another grueling 12-hour shift at the hospital. But that fragile calm shattered when she heard the rumbling outside. A low, synchronized growl of engines idled along her narrow street, a sound too heavy and too deliberate to be ordinary traffic. Danielle frowned, pushing herself out of bed and padding barefoot to the window. She pulled back the curtain and froze. Her street, usually quiet and sleepy, was lined with at least half a dozen black SUVs. Shiny, spotless, and intimidating, they were parked bumper to bumper along the curb, their tinted windows concealing whoever sat inside. Neighbors had already begun to stir. Curtains twitched. A man across the street paused mid-step with his trash can, openly staring. A little boy on a bicycle stopped at the corner, gawking in awe. Danielle's heart began to pound. For one wild moment, she wondered if this was some kind of police raid or federal sweep. But no, there were no flashing lights, no uniforms, no sirens. Just sleek, expensive cars that didn't belong anywhere near her struggling neighborhood. Her grandmother's voice called faintly from the hallway, asking if something was wrong. Danielle couldn't even form an answer. She only watched in disbelief as the rear door of the lead SUV opened. Out stepped the man from last night, the one she'd given $60 to at the gas station. But he didn't look nearly as ordinary as he had then. Gone were the faded jeans and polo. Instead, he wore a tailored charcoal suit that fit him perfectly, his salt and pepper hair groomed with precision. He carried himself with the same authority she had sensed the night before, but now it was magnified. His presence was undeniable. Danielle's mouth went dry. She stepped back from the window as though she'd been caught spying. A knock soon followed at the door, not tentative or timid, but firm. Confident. Her grandmother, frail yet perceptive, shuffled into the living room just as Danielle made her way down the hall. "Baby, what's going on out there?" she whispered, clutching her robe. Danielle shook her head, her mind reeling. "I don't know." The knock came again, sharper this time. Taking a breath, Danielle opened the door. There he stood, William, the stranger from the gas station, though he no longer looked like a man stranded and embarrassed. He looked like someone accustomed to commanding rooms and moving worlds. Behind him, two men in black suits and earpieces flanked the porch, their eyes scanning the street like hawks. "Good morning, Danielle," William said, his voice calm but resonant. "May I come in?" A doorway to opportunity. The living room felt smaller than usual with William inside it. Danielle sat perched on the edge of the worn sofa, her grandmother in her armchair nearby, both women studying the stranger who had invaded their quiet home. William, perfectly at ease, removed his jacket and folded it neatly over his arm before sitting across from them. The air carried a thick silence, broken only by the ticking of the old wall clock and the distant hum of the SUVs waiting outside. "I realize this is unexpected," William began, his voice smooth, deliberate. He didn't rush his words as though he had all the time in the world. "But I wanted to keep my promise. Last night you helped me without hesitation. Most people would have walked away, maybe even laughed at me, but you gave me $60 when you couldn't afford to. That kind of character," he paused, letting his gaze rest on Danielle, "is rare, and I don't take it lightly." Danielle shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't do it for attention. You needed help. That's all." William's lips curved into the faintest smile. "And that's exactly why I'm here. My name is William Harrington." The name hit Danielle like a splash of cold water. She had heard it before. Everyone had. Harrington was a billionaire entrepreneur, known for building empires in real estate and technology. A man often mentioned in magazines and business channels. She had seen his face in passing on the hospital television, though he usually looked untouchable, part of a world far removed from hers. The man in front of her was that same face, stripped of gloss but still undeniably powerful. Her grandmother blinked, recognition dawning in her weary eyes. "Lord have mercy," she muttered. "You're that man on the news?" William chuckled softly. "I suppose I am. But right now I'm just a man who lost his wallet at a gas station and was reminded of the goodness that still exists in people. He leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest. I want to repay you, Danielle. Not just the $60. Something more. I want to offer you an opportunity. The word hung in the air like a beacon, tempting and terrifying. Danielle's first instinct was suspicion. Opportunities didn't come to women like her. They were earned through blood, sweat, and exhaustion, not handed to you by billionaires in suits. She folded her arms, guarding herself. What kind of opportunity? William's eyes gleamed. The kind that changes lives. I run a foundation that invests in people with potential. People who work hard, who sacrifice, who embody values that can inspire others. Last night you showed me something powerful. You didn't know who I was. You didn't expect anything in return. You acted from compassion, and that, he said firmly, is exactly the kind of person I want to support. Danielle's throat tightened. She wanted to scoff, to dismiss it as some elaborate prank, but the sincerity in his tone and the fleet of SUVs outside argued otherwise. Still, she shook her head slowly. I don't take handouts. I've been taking care of my family since I was 19. I don't want charity. William leaned back, unoffended. Neither do I. This isn't charity, Danielle. This is an investment in you. I believe you have the strength and the heart to do more than just survive. You can lead. You can build. You can inspire. And I want to help you step into that future. Silence pressed into the room again, heavier than before. Danielle's grandmother reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. Marcus, who had been eavesdropping from the hallway, peeked out, his wide eyes filled with awe. The weight of their lives, their needs, their unspoken hopes, all of it hung in that pause. Danielle drew a shaky breath. She didn't trust easily, and the thought of accepting anything from a stranger, billionaire or not, frightened her. But a small voice inside her whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was the doorway she had been waiting for, the chance her family desperately needed. She looked at William, searching his face for deception. But all she saw was steady determination. He wasn't begging her to accept. He was offering, and the choice, she realized, was entirely hers. The legacy of 60, the Mobile Health Initiative, became more than just a project. It became a movement. In the months that followed its launch, word spread across Birmingham and beyond. Families who once avoided doctors out of fear of cost now found comfort in the bright white vans that rolled into their neighborhoods. Children received vaccinations, elderly patients obtained blood pressure screenings, and young mothers were given guidance on nutrition and prenatal care. Danielle was everywhere at once, greeting families, coaching volunteers, and working late nights to balance budgets and schedules. She often thought back to the gas station, to the man who had stood beside her in jeans and a faded polo, embarrassed at his lost wallet. At the time, she hadn't seen a billionaire. She had seen only another human being in need. Now, looking at the ripple effects of that single night, she realized the true weight of her decision. $60 had been the bridge between who she was and who she was becoming. That act of kindness had not only changed William's perspective, it had unlocked a door for her own destiny. William remained a steady mentor, though he increasingly stepped back to let Danielle shine. He often reminded her that leadership was not about being at the front, but about lifting others. The greatest legacy, he told her one evening, is not what you leave behind, but the lives you equip to carry the work forward. Danielle carried those words like a mantra. Her grandmother's health had stabilized. Her medications now affordable with the new resources Danielle could access. Marcus flourished, no longer burdened by shame or envy, but inspired by his sister's courage. He began speaking at community events alongside her, telling peers his age that their circumstances did not define their futures. For the first time, Danielle saw pride in his eyes that matched her own. It was then that Danielle understood. The true legacy of $60 was not the money itself, but the courage to act when it hurt, the willingness to give when it cost her something. And that was a lesson she vowed to pass on, not just to her family, but to everyone who crossed her path. Storms of success, yet with growth came storms. As Danielle's initiative expanded to other cities, the media took notice. Local news stations ran features on her from nurse to leader story, and soon national outlets followed. She was invited to conferences, honored with awards, and profiled in glossy magazines. Her face became a symbol of hope, but with that visibility came scrutiny. Reporters dug into her past, questioning her ability to lead given her modest upbringing. Opinion pieces speculated whether William's support had been purely philanthropic or something else. Strangers on social media debated her every move, some praising her as a role model, others dismissing her as just another charity case elevated for optics. The weight of expectation began to press on her shoulders. Every decision she made for the foundation was dissected, every mistake magnified. Danielle often returned home drained, feeling as though she was living under a magnifying glass. Her grandmother reassured her with quiet wisdom, reminding her that the brighter the light, the darker the shadows. But even those words could not erase the anxiety that gnawed at her. Her friendships remained strained. Some of her old friends reached out, but the conversations felt hollow, as if an invisible wall stood between their world and hers. Danielle longed for the comfort of belonging, yet she realized she could never truly return to the woman she once was. Success had remade her in ways that even she struggled to recognize, but she refused to let the storms drown her. Each time she wavered, she reminded herself of the faces in the clinic lines, of the mothers who cried tears of relief, of the children who laughed after receiving care. She learned to weather the noise, to distinguish between voices that sought to build and those that sought only to tear down. The storms, she realized, were proof she was moving forward, and so she pressed on, stronger for every battle. Bridges and healing amid the chaos of growth, Danielle recognized the importance of building bridges rather than walls. One evening, she reached out to one of her oldest friends, Keisha, who had stopped speaking to her months before. They met at a small diner on the edge of town, the kind of place Danielle used to frequent after long shifts. The conversation was awkward at first, thick with unspoken grievances. Keisha admitted she had been jealous, not because she didn't admire Danielle's rise, but because she felt abandoned. "We were struggling together," Keisha said softly, "and then suddenly you were gone, living in a world I couldn't follow you into." Danielle listened, tears filling her eyes, and realized how her transformation had looked from the outside, not as a shared victory but as a departure. That night, she promised herself to carry her people with her, not leave them behind. She began creating fellowship programs within her foundation for local leaders, ensuring that success was shared rather than centralized. She brought Keisha into the fold, inviting her to contribute her own ideas for community initiatives. Slowly, trust rebuilt, and with it, Danielle felt a piece of herself restored. At home, Marcus continued to blossom, his ambitions shifting from mere survival to aspirations of studying public health. Danielle encouraged him, proud that his dreams were no longer limited by the constraints that had once defined their family. Her grandmother, too, found healing in watching her granddaughter's work, her days brighter knowing that her sacrifices had not been in vain. The act of rebuilding bridges reminded Danielle of an essential truth. Leadership was not only about vision and progress, but also about humility and reconciliation. It was about returning to those you loved and saying, "Come with me, there is room for us all." A circle completed years later, Danielle drove down the same stretch of I-20 late one evening. The Mobile Health Initiative had grown into a national network, with clinics serving countless families across the country. Her name was known far beyond Birmingham, but she had never forgotten where it all began. That night, as her convoy of black SUVs hummed along the quiet road, she noticed a small gas station glowing against the darkness. Something compelled her to stop. She pulled in, her drivers and aides following behind, and for a moment she sat in her car, remembering the fluorescent lights, the crisp autumn air, the weight of exhaustion and doubt. She stepped out, her heels clicking softly on the pavement, and looked around. At the far pump, she saw a young man, perhaps no older than Marcus had been years ago. He stood frozen, patting his pockets, his face etched with panic. Danielle recognized the expression instantly, the look of someone realizing they had no way to pay for the gas they desperately needed. She walked over, her presence commanding but gentle, and asked softly, "You okay?" The young man looked up, startled. I lost my wallet," he stammered. "I don't know what to do." Without hesitation, Danielle pulled out her card and slid it into the machine. "How much do you need?" she asked, his eyes widened. "Ma'am, you don't have to." "How much?" She pressed, her tone steady. 40 should get me home." She keyed in the amount and watched the numbers climb on the pump. The young man stuttered his gratitude, tears brimming in his eyes. Danielle smiled softly, her heart swelling with the weight of memory. "You don't even know me," he whispered. Danielle placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes warm. "I don't need to. I just know what it feels like." As the convoy waited quietly behind her, she returned to her SUV, her soul at peace. The circle was complete. What had once been a desperate sacrifice had become a legacy of compassion, carried forward in countless lives. Danielle knew her journey was far from over, but at that moment she understood the truth that had guided her all along. It wasn't about the $60, or even the success that followed. It was about the courage to see someone's humanity and respond with kindness, no matter the cost. And so, as the engines roared to life and the convoy disappeared into the night, the story of a woman who once gave $60 at a gas station lived on, not just in headlines or foundations, but in the quiet, powerful choices of everyday people inspired to do the same. The sacrifice at the gas station, a life of care and sacrifice. The alarm clock never had to scream at Danielle Brooks anymore. Her body had grown accustomed to its rhythm of exhaustion, waking up before dawn, moving through her shifts like a machine and collapsing into bed long after the world had gone quiet. At 27, she had the kind of stamina that came only from necessity, not luxury. Her small brick house in Birmingham, Alabama, sat tucked away at the end of a cracked sidewalk lined with stubborn weeds. It wasn't much, but it was home. Inside, 3 lives depended on her. Her 15-year-old brother Marcus, who still struggled with the loss of their mother years ago, and her grandmother Gloria, a woman whose spine seemed to bend lower each year, weighed down not just by age but by arthritis and a history of working too many long shifts as a seamstress. Danielle worked as a nurse at St. Joseph's Hospital. The paychecks weren't glamorous, but they kept the lights on and food in the fridge. More importantly, the job fed her heart. She knew she was making a difference, even if her own life felt perpetually on pause. She also took night classes, aiming for her nurse practitioner's license because somewhere deep down, she believed in a better future. Every dollar in her bank account had a name: groceries, rent, Marcus's school supplies, Grandma Gloria's medication. There was no fun money, no cushion, no rainy day fund. Just enough to stretch like a rubber band on the edge of snapping. Yet despite the strain, Danielle never complained out loud. Her grandmother used to tell her, "The Lord gives his hardest battles to his strongest soldiers." Danielle had grown to resent that saying on her most tired nights, but she also knew her grandmother meant well. The weariness of the night. It was nearly midnight on a Thursday when Danielle pulled her battered Honda Civic into the Texaco off I-20. The hospital had been brutal that day, 2 double shifts in a row, capped off with an emergency surgery that left her covered in sweat beneath her scrubs. She parked at pump 4, slid her credit card into the machine and rubbed her burning eyes. The fluorescent lights of the gas station cast a pale glow on everything, making the world look sterile, almost dreamlike. The air was crisp with the bite of early autumn. The kind of night where the wind cut just sharp enough to remind you winter wasn't far away. Danielle hugged herself against the chill, shifting her weight as the gas meter clicked steadily upward. She thought about Marcus, who had texted her earlier, asking if she could buy him new sneakers this weekend. His old pair had holes in them, but Danielle knew she'd have to push it off another paycheck. Her heart squeezed. He was a good kid, but she feared how easily boys his age could slip into trouble, especially when they felt deprived. Her grandmother had been coughing more than usual, too. The medication helped, but the insurance only covered part of the prescription. Danielle had already done the math in her head. After rent, food, and utilities, there would barely be enough left. And here she was, filling up a gas tank that would drink $45 before hitting halfway. Money. Always money. Always the problem, the stressor, the invisible chain. The stranger. That's when she noticed him. The man at the next pump looked out of place. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in jeans and a faded polo shirt, he didn't seem threatening. But there was something about the way he carried himself, his posture, the quiet authority in his stance that made him stand out. His salt and pepper hair caught the fluorescent light, his face etched with lines that suggested years of leadership and decisions. Yet at that moment his expression was one of quiet frustration. Danielle watched as he patted his pockets, checked inside his car, then pulled out his phone with a look of defeat. His lips moved as he muttered something, but she caught it clearly enough. Damn it. He set the phone down on the roof of his car and let out a breath. Danielle glanced at her own meter. $45, half a tank. She chewed her bottom lip, a choice no one saw normally. Danielle kept to herself at places like this. The world wasn't always kind to women alone at night, but something about the man's demeanor tugged at her instincts. He wasn't angry, just lost, embarrassed, tired. You okay? She asked before she could stop herself. The man looked over, surprised by her voice. For a moment his eyes softened. I lost my wallet, he admitted almost reluctantly. Card must have slipped out somewhere. I was on my way home. His tone was calm, but the shame in his face was undeniable. Danielle hesitated. Every dollar mattered. She thought about the unpaid bills waiting on her kitchen table, about Marcus's shoes, about the prescriptions lined up on the counter. Still, before she could talk herself out of it, she swiped her card again. How much do you need? She asked. The man blinked, clearly taken aback. Oh no, I couldn't, it's fine. How much? She pressed, her voice firmer. He exhaled, shoulders slumping slightly. 60 will get me through. Danielle punched in the numbers quickly before her own doubts could stop her. The machine beeped, the pump clicked, and gas began to flow into his car. The man stared at her in disbelief. You don't even know me, he said quietly. Danielle forced a tired shrug, trying to hide the knot forming in her stomach. You looked like you needed help. And I've been there before. Don't worry about it. He opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. Instead, he extended his hand. William, he said softly. Danielle, she replied, giving his hand a quick shake. Hers was rough from countless hours of washing and sanitizing at the hospital. I'll pay you back, William insisted. Don't worry about it, Danielle said, cutting him off. She offered a faint smile, then turned back to her car. Safe travels. Her own pump clicked, signaling her tank was full. Danielle replaced the nozzle, climbed back into her Civic, and pulled away. The weight of 60 A's. The city lights blurred past her windshield. Danielle's chest tightened. $60. That was her grocery budget for the week. That was Marcus's shoes. That was Grandma Gloria's cough syrup refill. She gripped the steering wheel tighter. What have I done? But deep down, another voice whispered, You did what was right. She tried to push away the unease, but the truth lingered. Kindness always cost her. Whether it was extra shifts for her family, sharing her lunch with patients who couldn't afford theirs, or now helping a stranger in the dark. Still, as she pulled into her driveway, Danielle forced herself to breathe. Maybe it wouldn't matter in the long run. Maybe she'd figure out a way to stretch what little remained. She always did. She turned off the car, climbed out, and walked inside her home. Her grandmother was asleep on the couch, Bible resting on her chest. Marcus's bedroom door was cracked, his snores faintly audible. Danielle set her bag down, leaned against the wall, and let her exhaustion finally swallow her. One small act of kindness. Just $60. She never imagined it would change everything. The transformation begins. The days that followed were unlike anything Danielle had ever known. For the first time in her life, people in expensive suits called her by name and treated her as though her voice mattered. William arranged for her to visit his foundation's headquarters in downtown Birmingham, a glass and steel building that seemed to rise endlessly into the sky. Danielle felt out of place from the moment she stepped inside. She wore her neatest blouse and ironed pants, but compared to the tailored dresses and polished shoes of those around her, she felt like a child playing dress-up. Yet William, always composed and observant, walked beside her as though she belonged there more than anyone else. Inside, she was introduced to project managers, directors, and advisors who spoke about initiatives in education, healthcare, and community development. At first, the jargon overwhelmed her. Budgets, logistics, partnerships, sustainability. But then one of the directors asked Danielle about her own work at the hospital, about the challenges she faced balancing her job, school, and caregiving responsibilities. Danielle spoke honestly, her voice steady but tinged with fatigue. She described the patients who couldn't afford their medication, the families torn between paying rent and buying food, the young people who walked into emergency rooms not because they were sick, but because they had nowhere else to go. By the time she finished, the room had fallen silent. Danielle feared she had overstepped, but when she looked around, she saw faces filled not with judgment but with respect. William's eyes in particular seemed to shine with quiet pride. This, he told the room, is why we do what we do. Real people, real stories, real courage. That night, as Danielle returned home, she felt a stirring inside her chest that she hadn't experienced in years. For so long, her life had been about surviving day to day, paycheck to paycheck, worry to worry. But now, for the first time, she glimpsed something bigger. The possibility that her struggles could fuel change not just for herself, but for her entire community. She wasn't sure she was ready for it, but the thought alone was enough to keep her awake long after midnight, her mind alive with possibility. Trials and doubts, yet transformation never came without turbulence. The more time Danielle spent with William and his foundation, the more her ordinary world seemed to fray. At the hospital, whispers began to spread among her co-workers. Some teased her, calling her the billionaire's pet. Others whispered that she had gotten lucky or found herself a sugar daddy. Each word stung, not because Danielle believed them, but because she realized how quickly people were willing to tear her down the moment she stepped even slightly out of the box they had put her in. Her friends, too, began to pull away. When she tried to share her excitement about the projects she was learning about, they looked at her with suspicion. "Don't forget where you came from," one said sharply. Another rolled her eyes and muttered, "Must be nice to have rich folks notice you." Danielle tried to explain that it wasn't like that she hadn't asked for any of this, that she was still the same Danielle who counted every penny and worried about her grandmother's health. But it didn't matter. People saw what they wanted to see. At home, things weren't much easier. Marcus struggled with the sudden attention their family received. Friends at school asked him if his sister was dating a billionaire. Others teased him, saying he was only doing well in classes now because of connections. He came home one afternoon, slammed the door, and shouted that he was tired of living under a microscope. Danielle's heart broke, but she also knew she couldn't step back. Not now. She had seen too much, learned too much, and felt a calling deep in her bones. The worst moments came in the quiet of the night, when doubt crept in like a thief. Was she in over her head? Was she letting her family down by stepping into a world they didn't belong in? Was William truly who he claimed to be? Or was she just another project to polish his reputation? The questions haunted her, and sometimes she lay awake staring at the ceiling, wishing for the simple exhaustion of her old life, where all she had to worry about was bills and shifts. But each time, when she was ready to give in to fear, something reminded her of why she had started. A patient's thank you at the hospital. Her grandmother's whispered prayers of gratitude. Marcus finally sitting down at the table one evening and asking if she could help him with his homework. Those moments were small, but they kept her anchored, reminding her that growth was always uncomfortable, but it was also necessary. Rising to leadership over the next year, Danielle's world shifted in ways she could never have imagined. With William's mentorship and the resources of the foundation, she developed a proposal for a community health initiative aimed at providing affordable care to underserved families in Birmingham. It wasn't a grand world-saving plan. It was practical, rooted in her own experiences as a nurse and caregiver. She wanted to create mobile health clinics that could travel to neighborhoods where people couldn't afford or access regular care. At first, she was terrified to present it, standing in front of a boardroom of executives, her palms sweaty, her voice trembling. Danielle half expected them to dismiss her idea outright. But instead they listened. They asked questions, challenging her to think bigger, to refine her logistics, to consider sustainability. And when she answered, drawing from her first-hand knowledge of patients and families, she realized something remarkable. She wasn't just surviving in this room. She was thriving. She belonged here. With William's backing, the project launched within 6 months. The first mobile clinic rolled into a neighborhood not far from where Danielle grew up, its white sides gleaming with the foundation's logo. Children peered curiously as nurses handed out pamphlets. Parents lined up for checkups, and volunteers distributed medication samples. Danielle stood at the center of it all, her heart swelling with pride and disbelief. Marcus, now 16, was the first volunteer to sign up. He handed out water bottles and helped elders find their way inside, his once reluctant smile now wide and genuine. "You did this," he whispered to Danielle as the day wound down. She shook her head, tears in her eyes. "We did this," she corrected him. Her grandmother, too, attended, her frail frame supported by a cane, but her spirit alight with pride. She clasped Danielle's hand and said, "Baby, I told you the Lord had a plan for you. Look at you now." For the first time, Danielle didn't argue. She could feel it, too. The struggles of her past hadn't broken her. They had prepared her, and though the road ahead would still be filled with obstacles, she knew she wasn't the same woman who had once stood at a gas station, torn between survival and kindness. She was stronger. She was ready. She was becoming a leader. The quiet. After the storm, after years of ceaseless travel, public speeches, and relentless decision-making, Danielle realized she had begun to lose herself in the machinery of leadership. The foundation had become a global entity, operating in dozens of countries, employing thousands and inspiring millions. Yet at night, when she returned to her hotel or office, she often felt the echo of silence pressing against her. Her days were filled with people, yet sometimes she felt utterly alone. She decided, at William's urging, to take a sabbatical. It was the first time in nearly a decade that she allowed herself to rest. She returned to Birmingham, to the modest home where her grandmother had once kept watch from the couch, and she walked the streets of her old neighborhood quietly, without press or entourage. People recognized her, of course, but she smiled humbly, chatting with them as though she had never left. The quiet was uncomfortable at first. She had become addicted to movement, to the rush of progress. But slowly she remembered the small joys she had long forgotten, the taste of sweet tea on a porch in summer, the laughter of children playing tag in the street, the peace of waking without a schedule that demanded every ounce of her energy. In the stillness, Danielle reflected not on the battles she had fought, but on the woman she had become. Leadership had transformed her, yes, but it had also scarred her. Now she began to heal in the silence, finding strength not in applause but in stillness. The teacher becomes the student. During her sabbatical, Danielle traveled quietly, not to grand stages or conferences, but to humble villages and communities where her foundation's clinics now stood. She wanted to see firsthand the lives touched by her work, not as a leader, but as a learner. In a small village in Kenya, she met an elderly midwife who had been delivering babies long before modern clinics arrived. The woman, wrinkled and bent but fierce with wisdom, told Danielle stories of resilience and loss, of mothers who had died in childbirth, of children who had thrived against all odds. Danielle listened with reverence, realizing that true expertise did not always come with degrees or titles but with lived experience. In South America, she spent time with young activists fighting for clean water in their communities. They were fiery, unpolished, sometimes reckless, but their passion ignited something in Danielle. They reminded her of herself in those early days when she had nothing but conviction and courage. These encounters humbled her. She had been hailed as a teacher, a global leader, but here she rediscovered that she was always and must always remain a student. The world was filled with wisdom, if only one was willing to listen. A world of daughters and sons returning to her work, Danielle shifted her focus. She no longer wanted the spotlight to shine on her alone. Instead, she dedicated herself to nurturing the next generation. She began to speak less about her own story and more about the stories of the young leaders she mentored. She often joked that though she had no children of her own, she was a mother to a world of daughters and sons. From Birmingham to Nairobi, from Rio to Mumbai, she saw young faces looking to her not for answers but for affirmation that they too could rise. She poured her energy into creating networks of support, scholarships, and training programs designed to outlast her. Marcus, now in his late 20s, became one of her closest collaborators. Together, they developed youth-led councils that advised the foundation, ensuring that the vision was never locked in the past, but always evolving with fresh voices. Danielle's pride in her brother was boundless. She saw in him the best of their mother, the quiet strength of their grandmother, and the fire of her own sacrifices. Each time she watched a new leader step forward, Danielle felt a deep sense of peace. This was legacy, not buildings or titles, but lives set aflame with purpose. The breaking point. But even as Danielle built others up, her own body began to betray her. Years of stress, travel, and sacrifice had taken their toll. One morning, after a long week of meetings, she collapsed in her office. Doctors later told her it was exhaustion compounded by untreated hypertension. The news shook her to her core. She had built an empire of compassion, but she had neglected the vessel carrying it, herself. For weeks, she was forced into rest. The foundation ran without her, guided by the leaders she had mentored, and Danielle faced the uncomfortable truth that she was not indispensable. At first, this realization frightened her. If the world could move on without her, what was she worth? But slowly, she came to see it as the ultimate victory. Her vision was no longer dependent on her presence. It had become self-sustaining. Lying in her hospital bed, Danielle thought of her grandmother's words, "The Lord gives his hardest battles to his strongest soldiers." She realized now that strength was not only in endurance, but in knowing when to rest, when to let others fight while you healed. Passing the torch as Danielle recovered, she began preparing in earnest for the future. She knew she could not lead forever, and she wanted the transition to be intentional, not forced. She gathered her closest circle, Marcus, her top fellows, William, and trusted advisors, and began the process of shifting leadership. It was not an abdication, but a passing of the torch. She reminded them that the foundation was never about her name, but about the mission. "If it dies with me," she told them, "then I have failed. But if it lives through you, then we have succeeded." Marcus emerged as a natural successor, not alone, but as part of a collective leadership model. Danielle watched with pride as he spoke with confidence, negotiated with partners, and connected with young people. The boy who once asked her for new shoes had grown into a man ready to carry the flame. The moment she saw him leading a clinic opening without her by his side, Danielle felt no jealousy, no loss, only joy. The circle was widening, and that was how it was always meant to be. The immortal seed years later, as Danielle aged gracefully, she often sat in quiet reflection. Her hair had turned silver, her face lined with years of struggle and triumph. But her eyes still burned with that same compassion that once compelled her to give $60 to a stranger. She no longer traveled as much, content to watch from the sidelines, as the leaders she had nurtured carried the mission forward. What comforted her most was knowing that the seed she had planted had grown into a forest far beyond her imagining. Clinics operated in countries she had never visited, scholarships supported students she had never met, and stories of transformation reached corners of the world where her name was unknown. That anonymity pleased her. The work was what mattered, not the recognition. On quiet evenings, she returned to the memory of that night at the gas station. She realized that the seed had not been the $60, nor even the opportunity William gave her afterward. The true seed was the decision to act in love when it hurt most. That seed was immortal, passed down through every act of kindness inspired by her story. And so, Danielle Brooks, once just a tired nurse in Birmingham, became a testament to the truth that greatness is born not from wealth or status, but from small sacrifices made in faith. Her life was proof that when you plant seeds of compassion, they will outlive you, carrying your spirit into eternity. The return to roots after decades of global work, Danielle felt a stirring in her soul to return to the place where it all began. Birmingham had changed, but her old neighborhood remained much the same. Weathered houses, familiar sidewalks, and the scent of magnolia trees in summer. She walked slowly down the block where she once carried grocery bags heavier than her frame, where her grandmother used to wave at neighbors from the porch, and where Marcus learned to ride his bike. When word spread that Danielle had returned, families came out to greet her. Children clung shyly to their mother's skirts before running forward to hug her, while older residents clasped her hands and whispered blessings. They didn't see her as the global icon the world knew. To them, she was still Miss Brooks's granddaughter, the girl who never turned her back on family. Danielle decided to invest directly in her community again. She funded the restoration of her old school, turning it into a center for health, education, and mentorship. She rebuilt playgrounds, opened libraries, and created scholarships specifically for Birmingham's youth. It wasn't about monuments or prestige. It was about healing the soil that had once nurtured her. The return to her roots gave Danielle a renewed sense of peace, as though the circle of her life had gently folded back upon itself. Building bridges. Across faiths, Danielle's work had always been rooted in compassion, but she now saw a new role emerging, one of bridge building across divides of faith, culture, and identity. Invitations poured in from churches, mosques, temples, and synagogues, each community seeking her voice not as a political figure, but as a moral one. She accepted these invitations with humility, always careful to honor the traditions of those who welcomed her. In 1 month alone, she stood at the pulpit of a historic black church in Atlanta, spoke beneath the arches of a mosque in Cairo, and addressed a gathering of monks in Thailand. Though the rituals and languages differed, the message she carried remained constant. Kindness transcends all barriers. Her presence became a balm in a world too often fractured by fear and suspicion. Religious leaders began to call her a peacemaker, a woman who reminded people that compassion was the thread binding humanity together. Danielle resisted the grand titles, insisting she was just a nurse who had once given $60 to a stranger. Yet deep inside, she knew she had stepped into a calling larger than herself. The burden of recognition. As her influence spread, Danielle found herself recognized in nearly every corner of the world. Airports, restaurants, even quiet walks in the park. Someone always approached with a story of how her work had touched their lives. At first she welcomed these encounters, but over time, the weight of recognition became heavy. Privacy slipped through her fingers, and the world seemed to expect perfection from her at every turn. There were times when she longed for anonymity, for the freedom to sit in a diner with coffee and pie without someone snapping a photograph. Fame had never been her pursuit, yet it clung to her like a second skin. The Foundation's communications team carefully crafted her image. But Danielle sometimes wondered if the real woman, the tired, flawed, sometimes doubtful nurse from Birmingham, had been lost along the way. To counter this, she began carving out sacred spaces of solitude. She spent weekends at retreats where phones and cameras were forbidden. She returned often to her grandmother's Bible, its margins filled with handwritten prayers. These moments reminded her that recognition was fleeting, but faith and humility endured. Fame was a burden, but she carried it not for herself, but for the millions her story represented. Marcus's crossroads. As Marcus stepped fully into leadership, Danielle watched with pride but also concern. He had inherited her passion and their grandmother's wisdom, but he was still young and untested in the crucible of crisis. That test arrived when one of the Foundation's U.S. clinics faced a budget shortfall, threatening to close its doors. Protesters gathered outside, demanding answers, and the board grew restless. Marcus, thrust into the spotlight, struggled at first. He doubted himself, fearing he could never live up to his sister's shadow. Danielle resisted the urge to step in, knowing that true growth required space to stumble. Instead, she offered quiet guidance, reminding him that leadership was not about perfection but persistence. Marcus eventually rallied his team, launched a fundraising campaign, and secured new partnerships that not only saved the clinic but expanded its reach. The victory was his, and Danielle knew he had crossed a threshold. He was no longer simply her younger brother. He was a leader in his own right, with a path that would one day outshine even hers. The fire of renewal. A global pandemic erupted, shaking the world to its core. Healthcare systems buckled, economies collapsed, and fear spread faster than the virus itself. For Danielle, it was a moment of both dread and destiny. Her foundation was suddenly more critical than ever, yet the risks were immense. She mobilized her networks, converting mobile clinics into testing and vaccination centers. She coordinated international shipments of medical supplies, often negotiating directly with governments. She returned to the front lines herself, donning protective gear and working alongside nurses half her age. The fire that had fueled her in her 20s blazed anew in her 60s. The crisis claimed millions of lives, but it also reaffirmed the essential truth Danielle had always believed: compassion was the strongest medicine. Her tireless efforts during those dark years reignited global admiration, but more importantly, they reminded Danielle of why she had started. The work was not about her legacy. It was about love in action, about standing in the gap when humanity needed it most. A legacy written in stone and spirit. As the pandemic waned, governments and organizations sought to honor Danielle. Universities named scholarships after her, cities erected statues, and one country even proposed a national day in her name. Danielle accepted these honors graciously, but remained wary of monuments that risked overshadowing the mission itself. "Build clinics, not statues," she often told officials, her words reminding them that the true memorial to her life should be service, not stone. Still, she recognized the symbolic power of these gestures. A statue of her standing with a stethoscope and outstretched hand was unveiled in Birmingham, not far from the gas station where it all began. Tears filled her eyes as she stood before it, Marcus at her side, crowds cheering around them. She whispered a prayer of gratitude to her grandmother and mother, knowing that their sacrifices were etched into every honor she received. Yet even more than the stone, Danielle cherished the spiritual legacy she was leaving behind. She had inspired countless people to see kindness as power, not weakness. That spirit, she knew, would outlast any building or bronze figure. The river beyond the shore in her final years, Danielle spent more time by rivers. She said water reminded her of life, always moving, shaping the world quietly, persistently. She would sit for hours, watching the current carry leaves and branches downstream, reflecting on how her own journey had flowed from one choice into another, each twist and turn forming a larger story. One evening, sitting beside Marcus and a group of young fellows, Danielle spoke softly. "We are all rivers. What matters is not how wide we are, or how loud our waters roar, but whether we bring life to the shores we touch." Her words hung in the air, not as a farewell but as a final teaching. When she passed, the world mourned, but more importantly, it remembered. Clinics continued to operate, scholars continued to study, and strangers continued to help strangers in her name. The ripple of $60 had become an endless river, flowing beyond the shore of her own life. Danielle Brooks was gone, but her kindness was immortal. The global call years after her first mobile clinic rolled into Birmingham, Danielle found herself boarding a plane for the first time in her life. Her foundation had grown steadily, supported by William's mentorship and her own relentless drive, but now international organizations wanted to hear her voice. A conference in Geneva invited her to speak on healthcare access for marginalized communities. When Danielle stepped off the plane, nerves churned in her stomach. This was no longer about her neighborhood or even her country. This was about standing before the world. She walked onto the conference stage in front of hundreds of delegates from across the globe. Dressed in a simple navy dress, she carried no teleprompter, no stack of prepared notes, only her story. She told them about her grandmother's sacrifices, about counting coins for groceries, about the night she gave away $60 at a gas station when she barely had enough for herself. She spoke about dignity, about how access to healthcare was not a luxury but a right, about how compassion could build bridges where politics could not. When she finished, the hall erupted in applause. Reporters later called her the nurse who shook the world, but Danielle brushed aside the praise. What mattered to her was the moment afterward, when a delegate from a small African nation approached her with tears in her eyes and said, "Your story is my people's story. We need you to help us too." Danielle realized then that her mission had outgrown its birthplace. What began with a single tank of gas in Alabama was now a global call for justice, the weight of the world, but with global recognition came an even heavier burden. Danielle's days blurred into endless flights, meetings, and speeches. She worked across time zones, her phone buzzing with calls at all hours. Her body ached from the pace, her voice sometimes cracked from exhaustion, yet she pushed herself forward. The work was too important, the need too great. Her family began to worry. Marcus, now preparing for college, often reminded her to rest, while her grandmother insisted she was moving too fast for her own good. Danielle brushed them off, unwilling to admit that she sometimes woke with her heart pounding, her chest heavy, her spirit drained. Success had lifted her, but it had also shackled her with expectations that seemed impossible to meet. One night, alone in a hotel room in New York, Danielle broke down in tears. The weight of the world pressed down on her, and for the first time she questioned whether she had made a mistake. She thought about walking away, about disappearing into a quiet life where no cameras followed her and no boardrooms demanded her presence. But then she remembered the faces, the children who now had medicine, the mothers who could finally breathe without fear, the elders who whispered blessings as they left her clinics. Those memories steadied her. She realized she could not carry the world alone. Leadership was not about being the savior, but about building others to share the load. That night, Danielle made a decision. She would no longer be the only torchbearer. She would raise an army of light. Seeds of the next generation, Danielle began pouring her energy into mentorship. She launched fellowship programs not only in the U.S. but abroad, seeking out young men and women who carried the same fire she once had. the desire to change their communities despite impossible odds. She brought them into her foundation, trained them in leadership, connected them with resources, and most importantly, listened to their stories. One of her proudest moments came when Marcus, now a college sophomore studying public health, stood beside her at a ceremony to launch the Brooks Scholars Program. Named in honor of their late mother, it was designed to fund education for students from disadvantaged backgrounds who wanted to pursue medicine or community leadership. Danielle's heart swelled as Marcus delivered a speech that mirrored her own compassion and clarity. She saw in him not just her brother, but a future leader who would surpass her one day. In mentoring others, Danielle found renewal. Every new fellow, every young voice filled with vision, reminded her why she had chosen this path. The ripple of kindness was no longer hers alone. It was multiplying, spreading like seeds scattered by the wind. Each seed carried the potential for a forest she might never see, but one that would shade generations to come, storm and fire. The true test of Danielle's leadership came when one of her clinics abroad faced a devastating scandal. A corrupt official had siphoned funds meant for medicine, leaving families without care and the foundation's name tarnished in the media. Headlines screamed betrayal, critics pounced on the story, and donors began to hesitate. For the first time, Danielle's vision seemed on the verge of collapse. The weight of the scandal nearly broke her. She felt betrayed, humiliated, and furious all at once. The sleepless nights returned, filled with questions about whether she had trusted too much, stretched too far. Some advisors even suggested she distance herself, that perhaps she should let the project die quietly to protect her reputation. But Danielle refused. She flew to the country herself, standing before angry crowds who demanded answers. With no notes and no script, she apologized openly, admitted the foundation's failings, and promised to make it right. She met with families, sat with them in their homes, and listened to their stories. Slowly, trust began to return, not because of press releases or polished statements, but because Danielle showed up, face to face, heart to heart. The fire of the scandal forged her into steel. She learned hard lessons about accountability and vigilance, but also about resilience. From the ashes of the crisis, she rebuilt stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. She knew then that leadership was not about avoiding storms, but about walking through them with integrity. The eternal ripple years later, Danielle sat in the quiet garden of her foundation's new global headquarters. The air was filled with the sound of children laughing nearby, their voices a reminder of the countless lives touched by her work. Her grandmother had long since passed, leaving behind a legacy of faith and sacrifice that Danielle carried every day. Marcus was now a respected public health leader in his own right, running programs that reached even further than hers. And William, older now, remained her dear friend and advisor, proud to see how far she had come. Reflecting on her journey, Danielle often returned to that single night at the gas station. She marveled at how one choice made in exhaustion and uncertainty had grown into a movement that spanned continents. She realized that kindness was never wasted, that even the smallest act could create waves beyond imagination. Her story became one told in schools, shared in churches, whispered in families. But Danielle never saw herself as a legend. She saw herself as a woman who once had $60 and chose to give it away. Everything else had been grace, persistence, and the courage to keep choosing compassion even when it cost her. And so, as the sun dipped low in the garden and the laughter of children echoed around her, Danielle smiled. The ripple of that night would never end. It lived on in every clinic, in every scholar, in every act of kindness inspired by her story. The eternal ripple of $60 had become a river, and the world was better for it.